he ends his talk by saying 3 years ago, of course, that the euro is the best symbol and the best representation of what the idea of Europe is. So we have certain philosophical position which starts in classical Greece according to Husserl, goes all the way to where we are today, and which ends up on the one hand in France with the expulsions of the Roma, and on the other hand, and that is my final point, with the extension of Husserl's criticism of public reason through the application now of that kind of reason that comes out of the physical sciences, mathematics and so on, not only just in the humanities and the social sciences, but also in politics and democracy. The idea, which we knew up until 2 years ago, that now, because the economy has become naturalized, because the economy is so complex and needs such great expertise and knowledge and so on, it is not for the public, either in the different countries or indeed in the European Union, the Parliament and so on, to discuss these matters. Because the experts, those people who had turned, questions of justice, solidarity, equality and so on, have turned them into mathematical formulae. They tell us what we have to do, and the governments are there just to apply, to implement what those experts are saying. To that extent, Husserl's, I think, half-correct interpretation of what the idea of Europe was, and half-correct, as it were, indictment and accusation about the idea of Europe, has now become universalized, because it's no longer the humanities and the social sciences that falsely adopt an idea of reason which is totally inappropriate, and as a result they have failed, but it is also the other part of the Greek idea, democracy, that has fallen exactly under that same problem. That the idea of democracy has changed from the kratos of the demos, the power of the unwashed, of the great unwashed, that as Slavoj and others say, it is both the excluded, those who have no expertise and knowledge and wealth and so on to rule, but also who represent what is universal. So to that extent, for me, there is a fundamental difficulty at the heart of the European project now, including the project of the European Union, that we have gradually lost that idea that Europe, the idea of the universal, is not just about certain procedures, cognitive, scientific, application of certain rules and so on. It is about participation at all levels and about an understanding that power and the way that power is organized is always based upon a certain sense of domination and of the conflict that's created out of this domination. And this is what democracy was doing. It was accepting that we have conflict, that there is social conflict, that people, groups, classes and so on are against each other, and then we open democracy, which does what? It pacifies the conflict for a period of time, creating compromises, splitting up money and benefits and so on, and then conflict comes back again. What we're being told today, through that naturalization of the reason of democracy, is that basically conflict does not exist. Or if it exists, it is peripheral, it is on the edges, in the Acropolis in other words, the edges of the city, which is the Acropolis, and through the application of technical reason, we are going to get rid of this.
No, I want to counter to this. Because you confirmed me in my... I'm totally pro-European, to provoke you. Because I will say that the critique of Europe, now I will talk as a philosopher, the critique of Europe that you developed is only imaginable within Europe.
I agree.
All great, now you will get me in my European words, all decolonization movements arise from intellectuals who imported them from Europe. What is independent India? An invention of Indian liberals schooled in Cambridge, and so on and so on. So this is correct. Second point, don't fall into this trap too much. I think that both Heidegger and Adorno and Husserl fall into this trap, putting the blame of political oppression onto, this idea of instrumental reason. The origin of totalitarianism is that procedures which are appropriated to quantitative sciences, technology, we apply them to politics. I think leave science alone. I don't think this is simply true. If you look closely at how actual totalitarianisms functioned, Stalinism, Nazism, etc., they, of course, we can play the Hannah Arendt game, they killed the Jews scientifically, blah, blah, but the fundamental mode of power was absolutely not a kind of a scientific objectivization, like we treat workers like technological material. This is why in my book, the previous one, In Defense of Lost Causes, I ironically titled, of course it's a critic of Stalin, one chapter, How Did Stalin Save the Humanity of Man? Where my thesis is that if you look at these pure instrumental reasons, it was in the 20s in the Soviet Union. It was a tremendous, almost technologically agnostic movement claiming we are now creating a new man, we will reconstruct it, genetically humanity and so on. And they even spoke about the ideal of a man who will no longer feel things, but like when he will feel thirsty, it will not be a real subjective feeling, it will be like, you know, some indicator showing you
you should feel.
You should feel, you should get blah blah. So what I'm saying is that don't leave. Point two. Yes, I totally agree with your point.
I don't want you to agree with me. I want to disagree.
When I say I agree with someone, here is the ticket for Gulag, one way. Yes, so don't worry. No, but what I want to say is that. Look at the duality that you found, but what I find nonetheless, my God, now you put me into a position of some kind of a preacher of Western democracy, liberal. Look, human rights, of which you are specialist. I am the first to subscribe that there was always this catch, you know, human rights apparently for all, but you look at it closely, some are excluded. But nonetheless, there is one thing you must admit. From the very beginning, things exploded out of control. You had immediately Mary Wollstonecraft. Why not women? You have blacks. Why not blacks? Haiti Revolution. I claim an event greater than French Revolution itself, maybe. It's the first example of a rebellion of colonized people, not on behalf of we will return to our shitty old tradition.
But no. Sorry, here also you're becoming a bit too simplistic. Of course.
No.
Of course, in all the major revolutions of modernity, after France, after the United States and France, the idea of rights becomes the rhetoric and the ideology of the revolution. So there is indeed within the concept of human rights a kind of nascent endowment inscription of the revolutionary insurrection. Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But when we're talking about human rights today, for the middle classes of the West, we're talking about something totally different. Indeed, I should also add that precisely against that revolution tradition which both in the American Constitution and the French Declaration des Droits de l'Homme inscribes the right to resistance, the whole United Nations tradition, the Universal Declaration, the European Declaration and so on, explicitly say that foreigners should not allow to have political rights, but even more importantly, that nobody could use these rights in order to challenge the established social and political system. So we have moved from that absolutely honorable and central tradition, you mentioned Wollstonecraft, you mentioned
but I agree with you.
to something which now includes in a dormant state the idea of human rights as a revolutionary ideology, and that happens in the streets of Athens when these kids go out and fight, but also the way in which liberalism, a kind of middle-class capitalist liberal dispensation, has created human rights as its own main ideology. To that extent, human rights are split. It is not the same thing.
I'm even very critical.
We use this term, human rights.
All I'm not saying is a very modest thing, that philosophical even, and even if we go to Adorno and Horkheimer, in their dialectic of Aufklärung, they always emphasize it must be a self-critique of enlightenment. So I only wanted to say that...
That's the immanent critique, actually, the immanent critique. So it has to be the non-immanent critique, that comes from outside, from communism. That does not come
communism is not outside. Why do you think? I think communism is strictly, again, I'm saying this to provoke you, something that strictly could have emerged only in European tradition. And more, my visit to India to provoke them, I quoted that infamous text by Marx on the infamous by post-colonialist on the results of the British colonialism in India, where he says, yes, the British brought horror, but at the same time they brought chance for freedom, development, and so on and so on. I tend to underwrite them. Are we aware to what extent, let's take all this post-colonial theory and so on, how deeply European phenomenon this is? Are we aware how? And here I'm fully for European tradition.
But I don't disagree with you.
We don't have a choice.
I don't disagree with you. What I'm saying is that the big question which we discussed earlier on also of the universal, which is presented in one dominant and I think in also a quite problematic way, as a universalism of cosmopolitanism, of international law, of the Hague, of human rights and so on, is one part of that tradition which, however, has more or less occupied the whole field of the universal and has left out the kinds of universals and the kinds of truths that you and I would fight for. And this is my problem. My problem is not generally against human rights. I just see that today, for the middle class of America and Britain and Europe where we live, of course human rights has become a synonym for a liberal capitalist mode of living. For those outside, of course, they mean nothing because they don't have it. So we need another conception of the universal on top of that.
Yeah, but what I will say here is here is the following. Here again, my God, let's provoke each other. No? Here again, I would say that universalism, precisely emancipatory universalism, is possible only against the European background. Because now
we totally agree. That's what I said.
Yeah, because I will now give you a very brutal thesis, and I confirmed this when I was in China, in India, and so on. You know, their notion of justice, brutally, explicitly now in today's communist China, remains this old corporate Confucian. They now strive, the Chinese, for, they call it no longer communism, harmonious society. Then with my evil Socratic mind, I asked them innocently, okay, what do you mean by harmonious society? They told me it's a society which works harmoniously because everyone is at her place doing his appropriate job. Leader is a good leader, woman is a good woman, worker is a good worker, and I told them it's wonderful. We no longer have these multicultural agreements, we know what we are talking. In Europe we call this corporate fascism. No problem, we know, no? So what I'm saying is that what I find, and this is the basis for what you so wonderfully put it, to propose the excluded as the site of universality, the big thing in Europe, let's look back at, started with Greek here around the corner, with Demos, in Christianity. What do they have? Universalism, not just as we are all part of universal humanity, but the idea, and this is for me crucial, that I am allowed to participate in universality independently of my particular social and so on position. This goes against the corporate position where you contribute to universal harmony by doing your proper